day before Thanksgiving in 1971, a man identifying himself as Dan Cooper bought a plane ticket from Portland to Seattle. He hijacked the plane, claiming he had a bomb in his briefcase, and demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He jumped out of the plane with the money and the bomb somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, never to be seen again. The FBI claims to have investigated over 1,000 people, including dozens of deathbed confessions. In 2016, 45 years after the hijacking, the FBI suspended its investigation of the case. While the FBI is no longer looking for D.B. Cooper, there is a community of people who are trying to solve the case on their own. Welcome to the Cooper Vortex. In this episode, we're excited to introduce a newcomer to the Vortex. Daniel Baer is a senior in high school, but with all the recent free time he's had thanks to COVID-19, he's managed to track down a very interesting suspect. I actually started to pursue the same suspect, but I quit before making any real progress. Luckily, Dan is no quitter, and he was able to track down his suspect through some vague clues someone else posted on the DB Cooper subreddit. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to my good friend, Daniel Baer. Dan, when was the first time you heard about DB Cooper?
First time I heard about DB Cooper. I don't remember. I've known about the case for a number of years now, just from like the influence of modern media, documentaries, videos, references in pop culture, things like that. I didn't really start getting invested in the case until, obviously, with the coronavirus, you're stuck at home. And, previous to that, I was involved in all sorts of clubs and sports and things like that. So I had a lot more free time in my hands than I usually do. And so I kind of got interested into true crime a little bit. But a lot of true crime cases are kind of like murder and sort of gory crimes. And I'm just, that's not real. I don't really enjoy looking into those sorts of things. But the DB Cooper case is just so different from every other crime out there, just in style, and no one got hurt. And the method in which the hijacking was carried out is different from any other sort of crime or hijacking that's out there. It's different from even other hijackings of aircraft. It's just so different. It really stuck out to me, and I started to get interested in the different suspects and in the case, and now I'm on the Cooper Vortex. So,
And what avenue did you go down when you started to research this case? Were you looking into certain books, documentaries, websites?
well, the first thing I do, when I'm researching any topic is Wikipedia. That's the first place you go. So you go on Wikipedia, you read about the different suspects and all the things about the case, and then I went to YouTube, like everyone else at my age group, watched a couple things there, and then started looking at different websites, obviously, and there's quite a few geared towards specific suspects. So I was looking at dbcooperhijack.com. That was a big one. There's I think Bruce Smith's website, Mountain News. I was looking over there. And then I tried to get on the DB Cooper forum, but that's kind of I don't know how to describe it, more of an advanced sort of discussion platform. So I figured one of the best...
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, polite way to put it. And so I figured the best place, I joined the subreddit, the DB Cooper subreddit. It's small, but there was some good discussion happening on there. And that's how I found the person I'm going to talk about today, is actually on the subreddit. And yeah, so I just started becoming involved on there. It wasn't that big of a commitment. And yeah, so that's how I started discussing the case in more detail.
And a gal who we're going to call Cindy posted on the DB Cooper Reddit a few months back now. When was the first time that she mentioned this?
So the first time I was aware of it was, a while back. It was actually a comment on, I think, a post I made that was, just discussing the different DB Cooper suspects, and Cindy had said, well, I think my father's DB Cooper. And if anyone's been on the subreddit, you know that there's a lot of that. Oh, my brother's DB Cooper. Oh, the guy I worked with was DB Cooper. And I just kind of, I was like, okay, yeah, you think your father's DB Cooper? Yeah, sure. But I decided, you know what, I'll direct message this person. They probably won't want to talk to me after 5 minutes, but uh, that wasn't the case. And I was able to eventually start a dialogue with this person and learn more about her father, develop a circumstantial case as to why he could be considered a DB Cooper suspect.
But she would not tell you who her father was, correct?
No, she would tell me everything and all these very specific details about her father, but she wouldn't give a name. Uh, she told me all about his military service and his family life, how he grew up. But she didn't want to give a name, and I understand that. You don't want people looking into your father. I hate to use this word, but when you kind of advertise it like that, like, oh, I think my father's DB Cooper, and you give out all of these specific details about your father, um, especially with the internet, the research capabilities you have now. It was only a matter of time before I was able to narrow it down and find someone that fit the description. And I eventually, told her, I think I know who your father is. And after that, she was a lot more forthcoming with information and discussing her father. So yeah, that's how I was made aware.
And who's the suspect that you started looking into, Dan?
So his name is Jessie Lee Smith, and he's a really interesting guy. I mean, like, there isn't a boring DB Cooper suspect. I think we can all agree on that. And he's just another
For
one of the
sure.
there's he's just another interesting DB Cooper suspect, and he's different from all of the other suspects in a lot of ways, which I'll talk about later. So he's just a very interesting character, and I don't think I would have really invested so much of my time in researching him and what he did if he didn't really fit the bill, as I say, because to be a good DB Cooper suspect, you really have to fit certain criteria. You have to explain the tie particles. You have to match the physical description. Um, you have to have a motive. So it's not like you can just say, "Oh, well, my coworker looked like DB Cooper, but we worked at a bank together." That that's really not that really doesn't explain a lot of what we do know about DB Cooper. So once I was able to sort of check off certain things on the list, okay, he worked with chemicals, uh, he had a motive, he met the physical description. Then I started really investing my time in researching about this man's life.
The first question I have whenever someone says they have a DB Cooper suspect is how old was he in 1971?
He would have been 47 in 1971. So fitting the age description, and I think 47 is a very, very good age because, people claim Rackstraw's DB Cooper, he was 28, 29. People claim Klansnick was DB Cooper, which he was, I think, 51. So there's a large range of ages, and 47 is really, I mean, they said mid 40s. So once I found out, he was 47, that was kind of it.
So where'd you go next? You found this guy's name. There are certain things that are starting to fit. What research do you do next?
Well, once I found the name and once I told Cindy about the name, I had, asked, would it be all right if I just asked you questions about your father, what he did, uh, possible motive? And she was very, yeah, sure, go ahead. And I started to, learn about this guy. So one of the main things for me in identifying the DB Cooper suspect is, of course, the tie, which is probably the best evidence we have in narrowing down a DB Cooper suspect. And she had mentioned before, oh yeah, my father worked in the chemical industry. I think he can match the tie particles. So I asked, where did he work? And in 1971, he was working for a company called Courtaulds. And what they do is what they did, they're not in business anymore, but they manufactured rayon, which is a sort of synthetic fiber. And I was like, oh, okay, can we make some of the chemicals fit? So then I went on to Tom K's website, uh, citizensleuths.com, and started looking at, what chemicals do they find on the tie? And, I saw the list, and then I started learning about rayon production. And I'm still not an expert on rayon production. I got a B in chemistry. So a lot of these terms, a lot of the files I'm reading don't make much sense. But, I was able to learn that in rayon production, they do use some of the chemicals that were found on the tie. Not all of them, but one of the things that stuck out is they found both barium chloride and barium sulfate on the tie. And I mean, they're used in a lot of industries, but they're used specifically in rayon production as agents in the chemical reactions used to produce it. And so I'm like, oh, that's very interesting that two of the chemicals on the tie were used in the same industry he was working in 1971. But then again, those are only two chemicals. That doesn't explain the titanium, and they found cerium on the tie. So once I found out he worked in that industry, I asked Cindy again, prior to that, did he work anywhere else? And before he worked for Courtaulds, the rayon company, he worked at a different chemical company in Pensacola, Florida. And this is where things started to get really interesting in connecting some of the chemicals on the tie to what Jessie Smith was working with in 1960s and whatever. So all Cindy knew was that he worked for a fertilizer company in Pensacola. So I, Google search fertilizer company, Pensacola, Florida. And turns out there's only one, which made my life a lot easier. And it was called the Agrico Chemical Company, and they made synthetic inorganic fertilizers. And, when I was researching Courtaulds, the rayon company, I started, there wasn't a lot of information. There was a little bit. With Agrico, the fertilizer company, I started noticing that there were a lot of articles and a lot of news articles and PDFs, and I was like, why is there so much interest? It turns out that Agrico and a company next door to Agrico are grouped into an EPA Superfund site. And what that is there was high levels of contamination going on in those facilities. A lot of pollutants, a lot of toxic materials were used and produced in those two factories. And I'm like, wow. And the benefit of that is the EPA still to this day, even though the plants closed in the 70s and 80s, still conducts regular testing on the chemicals found on that site. And so there's 20 plus 300-page or whatever documents of all of the testing they did at these sites. And I found one that, outlines pretty much all of the chemicals they found at the site once they closed. And, I'm looking at Tom K's list of chemicals found on the tie, and I'm looking at this document, and I was just blown. Every single most chemicals I could just check off immediately. They were finding titanium at the site. They found cadmium, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing these correctly. Vanadium, cobalt, zinc, strontium, yttrium, and they found a lot of other chemicals too. But those chemicals were found on Cooper's tie, and they're also in this report from the EPA which they did at the chemical plant he worked at. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty big. And so I found another article because just because those chemicals were there doesn't necessarily mean they got on the tie. The EPA in the report said that there were only trace amounts found in the area. So that doesn't necessarily, it's not a smoking gun. Oh, just because they're there, they could have ended up on his tie.
Right.
So I found another article, and it turns out because of all the pollutants released at this factory, the surround because the two factories were back to back, Agrico and uh, I think it was called the Escambia Wood Treating Plant or something. They're back to back, both in a residential neighborhood. And so all of these pollutants and things were going into the residential neighborhoods, and they can't have that. People were developing cancer and all sorts of terrible diseases from these pollutants. And I was finding, I guess you could say, testimony from people who lived in the area saying that the pollutants released from these factories, it was, they would walk home from school or work or whatever, and it would be so thick they couldn't breathe. This was blocks away from the factory. So if you can think blocks away from the factory, they had to cover their faces because they couldn't breathe because of all of these chemicals or whatever. If you're working in that environment, right next door or in the factory, you're definitely going to have contamination on your clothing. You're definitely going to have contamination on your tie. That was a very interesting thing that I found. So this essentially proves that contamination would have been possible on clothing, like a tie.
Did he wear a tie to work?
So it's, I won't say it's foggy as to what his exact role is. Cindy believes he was the plant's electrician and would have managed. She said he was either the plant's electrician or an electrical engineer at the plant. So I don't know. I don't think I found specifically with the rayon production. I found a video from the time period, the general time period, sort of outlining what the factory was like, and it was a quick video, only a couple minutes, and the only person wearing a tie in the video was, I guess, a chemist or a scientist who worked at the plant. All of the people operating the machines and working in the factory weren't wearing ties; they were wearing like uh, blue collar outfits, and that concerned me a little bit. But I mean, it was only a quick video. Um, I mean, I wasn't showing everything in the plant, and so I don't. He wasn't working in the factory operating the machine or filling bags of fertilizer or whatever. He was working. He was working with engineers at at these plants. So I think it's very possible. Also considering that it's a clip-on tie. It's not a wraparound tie. It's not a fancy tie. It's a cheap J.C. Penney clip-on tie. I mean, if he had to, he could take it off easily, put it back on again. I think it's possible he wore that tie to work frequently. Maybe not 24/7, but frequently. He showed up in it, put it on for an hour during lunch, put it back on again when he was leaving. So it's possible that contaminants could have gotten on the tie, and it's possible he could have worn the tie at work.
Did he have any military experience?
Yes, very much so. So, unfortunately, I doubt that I'll be able to get his records, and that's due to in 1973 there was a big fire at the Army Personnel Records in St. Louis, the building they were held in, and he was in the Army, and 80% of Army records were incinerated in the fire. So it's unlikely I'll ever see his actual military records, but I was able to confirm that he was enlisted in the Army Signal Corps. And what they did, the Army Signal Corps handled communications, radar, radio operations. And so I was able to confirm that. I was able to confirm that he enlisted in the Army. And one of the first things Cindy shared with me was a video. She said her father served in New Guinea. And she shared with me a video, you can find it on YouTube, called The First Fighters of New Guinea. It's a very historical video. It's about 40 minutes long, detailing Allied personnel in New Guinea during the war. And she said, well, if you go to this specific part in the video, you'll see my father for about a second. And this was before I had any other photographs of him. So when she showed it to me, I'm like, yeah, he's in there for a second. That could be anybody. I was very skeptical and kind of just threw it to the side. After I had photographs of him, I went back and watched the video and stopped at the point she said to stop. And I'm like, that's him. It's definitely him. So I don't doubt that he was in New Guinea. He was definitely in the Army Signal Corps. I don't doubt that he was in New Guinea. And if I could just for a second describe New Guinea during World War II, it was probably some of the worst natural conditions that Allied soldiers had to face. You think about you know fighting in Europe, Normandy. Those were no doubt terrible conditions, but that was more fighting wise. Um, they had plenty of developed roads in France and Germany or whatever. They had plenty of there was telegraph line already set up. Papua New Guinea was a completely different story. The terrain was dense jungle. Allied soldiers, Western soldiers had never seen anything like this. Dense jungle, swampland. It was boiling hot. There were no roads. There was no telegraph wire or telephone wire. Very primitive. You had these guys were hauling, 100 pound equipment through jungle trails. And it would rain pretty much every day. If you've ever seen Forrest Gump when he's in Vietnam, and it's raining buckets, that was Papua New Guinea during World War II. It was raining 90% of the year, and so if you can imagine Jessie Smith in Papua New Guinea, he's having to haul all of this heavy equipment through mud and jungle trails, and it was probably some of the worst fighting conditions. So when I hear, oh, not to mention the disease, malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, were all, disease was a big problem in Papua New Guinea. So when I
So
hear,
there's no party to hang out there.
oh no, it was easily some of the worst conditions in the war. And when I was watching the first fighters in New Guinea video, you see some of that, but you don't see all of it. You see them like playing baseball and having fun, and uh, I've read stories on military websites and things that wasn't the case. You know, these Allied troops they weren't having a good time. It was pretty bad most of the time, year round. So when I hear that DB Cooper, if he landed in the woods, he would have had a hard time surviving. If Jessie Smith survived New Guinea, he came home in one piece. He would have had no problem spending, 2-3 hours finding a road in Washington State. I don't think survival in the elements was a concern of his.
It's not a concern at all. I've heard people bring that up before that, oh, maybe he survived the jump but then died in the woods. No. No, I'm not buying that for a second. If the drop zone is correct, it's a populated area of Washington state. I mean, there's roads everywhere, there's houses everywhere. I mean, if the drop zone is accurate, there isn't any direction that he could have walked and not have hit a road or something by morning. I mean, it's ridiculous to say that he would have died in the drop zone. If he survived the jump, he got out of there.
Yeah, I've looked at maps. The FBI loves to say I was watching the Unsolved Mysteries with, and I think they had Himmelsbach on, or one of the FBI agents, and Himmelsbach was like, "Oh well, if you survive the jump, he's gonna die. He's gonna die in a stream or something. He's gonna freeze to death." And obviously, of course, the FBI is gonna say that. But if Jessie Smith was able to survive New Guinea for years, he would have been fine in Washington State for a few hours. Not to mention,
Oh yeah.
also, he grew up in southern Alabama, which I guess I'll talk about a little bit later. Southern Alabama is a very swampy area. He was in the woods a lot as a kid, no doubt, and would have, I'm sure, had some sort of uh, outdoors experience prior to even joining the army. So I don't doubt for a second that he would have had any problems getting out of Washington State if he survived the jump.
Did he have parachute experience?
So this is something, regrettably, I don't have a lot of information on. Cindy says, "Oh yeah, he did paratrooping in Washington State." That's what she said. I'd love to believe that 100%. I don't know. I know Army Signal Corps training. They went to it was held at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and Cindy confirmed this. Oh yeah, he talked about being in New Jersey for training. I believe that, and then obviously he had to go to the Pacific, the west coast of the U.S. to get on a ship to go to New Guinea. Whether that was California or Washington, I don't know. I would think if you're sending, because Papua New Guinea, they're still finding plane crashes from World War II to this day. Every couple months, there seems to be another plane they find either on land or in the water surrounding the island. So if you're sending Allied troops to New Guinea, having paratrooping experience, I think, would have been a very wise choice to make, considering that planes were crashing left and right, um, and people
Oh,
were
that's a good point.
and people were bailing out of airplanes frequently. I would think I was listening to the Cooper Vortex podcast where it was the anonymous analyst who was talking about William Smith, and for the Navy they had paratrooping, at least some basic paratrooping experience. And he would have been on a ship, or I think he was reconnaissance. But you know, if they're doing paratrooping practice or training in the Navy, they're going to be doing it in the Army, sending guys to New Guinea. So I'm pretty sure he had paratrooping experience. To the extent, I don't know.
What do you think his motive was?
Motive's important when having a DB Cooper suspect. I firmly believe that you don't hijack an airplane for no reason. If you look at other airplane hijackings, there seems to be some kind of reason aligned with it. So Jessie Smith in 1971 had 7 kids, and I obviously don't have any kids. I can't imagine what it would have been like, raising 7 kids. He wasn't college educated. He was. I don't think he was making a ton of money. He would have probably been making enough for himself, and if he had a wife or 1 or 2 kids. But 7 kids, he probably just needed money. If I'm being honest, he had just had about a year prior had a newborn, so I think just he needed money. I think that's probably the motive there, is he just needed money, and this was the best way to get it in his mind. Because if you think about it, if he hijacks a plane in the Pacific Northwest, where is the last place in America they are going to look? Alabama. I mean, there. I don't. I was skimming through, looking through the FBI archives they have on the DB Cooper case, and I'm seeing nothing of them looking in Alabama at all. They would have not even suspected that Cooper could have been from the South. They were saying, oh well, he could have been he's probably from the Pacific Northwest, could have been from the Midwest, maybe the East Coast, but you see nothing on the South. So
That's true.
I think that's what if Jessie Smith is DB Cooper, going to the Pacific Northwest would have been the safest place for him.
What about an accent?
So Cindy tells me that if he was going to see a doctor or go out in public and meet important people, he wouldn't speak with a Alabama country accent. He would speak intelligently. He would speak sort of without that accent. And Jessie Smith was an intelligent guy. He was working with people with college degrees. Oftentimes, he was teaching his kids. He was not he was a very smart guy, and he only had a grammar school education. At least that's what his enlistment record says. Is he only has a grammar school education. And something that's interesting is if you look on his draft card, which is available online, his signature is very artistic. And the reason I bring that up is, if you have a grammar school education, your penmanship is probably not going to be that great. And his signature is it's very artistic. It's very, it looks like he's been highly educated, just the way he signs his name. I've looked at other draft cards of different people. For example, my great grandfather, who had a high school education, his signature is a lot more, I don't want to say shaky, but it's a lot more, you know,
Crude.
yeah, exactly. And, if that's with a high school education. Or Jessie Smith, if he had a grammar school education, he's signing his name like Picasso. I would think that guy's probably pretty intelligent.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I like that. What do you think about Cindy? Do you think that she's telling the truth about all this? Did Jesse say to her that he was Cooper?
The reason she believed he was Cooper at all, because I think she didn't even know who DB Cooper probably was until she said that her father had some sort of allergic reaction to medication or something and was alluding to burying the money and hijacking the airplane and things like that. So, and then once he came to, Cindy had brought it up to him. Hey, you said all this, and he was like, "Drop it. We don't need to discuss that." So
That's interesting.
at first I was pretty skeptical because she wouldn't, she wasn't providing any uh, name or anything. Obviously, I understand that, but once I found out that he was a real person with real military experience and everything she was saying, in terms of family and things, was checking out completely. I st- I start I started to I went I started to trust her a little bit more, trust what she was saying a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like you were saying about that Papua New Guinea video. You just brushed it off, but then once you saw their photos of him, you went back and you were like, "Oh yeah, that is him. That's him."
Yeah, I have. She shared a photo with me of him in uniform, actually, which is another point that he had some sort of military experience. And the face in that photograph compared to the one in the video, it's an almost perfect match. So I believe with 99.99% certainty that it's the same guy, and that would have placed him in Papua New Guinea.
What percentage certainty would you say that Jessie Lee Smith is DB Cooper?
I don't think I can place a percentage on it. I think I think there's a good circumstantial case that he's DB Cooper, better than some of the other suspects I've seen. But I think it's a little improper for me to say he's DB Cooper 100%. I believe he's absolutely DB Cooper because there's no physical evidence. There's no money. There's no parachute. There's no there's no physical evidence. There's no DNA or anything. So I think I have a good circumstantial case that he's DB Cooper, but I don't know if I can necessarily place a percentage on it. I, yeah, I don't think that's something I can do.
What's your best piece of evidence for Jesse, and what's your worst piece of evidence? Or what's the best piece of evidence against him?
The best piece of evidence I would say is probably the tie particles. I've been able to connect at least most of the rarer particles that they talk about to the industries he worked in. The worst piece of evidence against him that I can think of is the location. He had a wife, he had 7 kids at the time. He lives in southern Alabama, and suddenly he would have to be in Portland, Oregon to hijack this airplane. Now, I did some research on that. It was definitely possible to accomplish during that 4-day Thanksgiving weekend. I definitely believe that. I didn't at first, but I was able to track down some airline timetables from the period, and it turns out that National Airlines was operating flights from Mobile to San Francisco during that time period. And obviously, once you're in San Francisco, getting a flight to Portland is not that difficult. So if he had a period of time, like a 4-day weekend for Thanksgiving, he could have probably gotten there, gotten out of the airplane, gone back to Portland, and back during that time period.
What about the money?
Cindy says that it's buried somewhere. She believes she has a general location, personally, if the money's out in the elements somewhere, it's probably deteriorated or gone at this point. It's been 48 years now. The only way money would survive, in my opinion, this long down the road, is if it was stored in a safety deposit box or in a chest or something. If he had buried it, maybe there's a possibility it's still out there. I don't exactly have high hopes. I, you know, it may not be buried at all.
If he did it for the money, why'd he bury the money?
This is more of a personal belief of mine, and I don't love speculating, but most of DB Cooper is just speculating. You kind of have to.
Oh,
Um,
I love speculating.
there's a lot of it,
Yeah.
but I'm pretty sure he lost at least half, if not more, of the money. They found some on Tina Bar. I don't think it's possible for him to have successfully jumped out of the airplane and get on the ground with $200,000 or a figure close to $200,000. I believe he probably got out with half or less. Just because, I mean, it's in $20 bill denominations. It's quite a few bundles he's carrying. The conditions were not ideal. Most of it probably got lost. It probably flew away in the wind, and what he did have, he may have gone back home and realized, look, I only need this much. It's probably not wise for me to spend all of this money. Because, I mean, if Jessie Smith, he was not a rich man. If he just starts going around with stacks of $20 bills, people are going to start suspecting something. So he probably took a little bit of the money for himself and probably buried the rest. I don't know, but that's just my personal belief on what happened.
So where's the money buried?
So Cindy says there's a 20-mile radius in the woods in southern Alabama. She thinks it could have been buried. She's not positive on it, and I don't. I mean, unless a bunch of the Cooperites want to take a trip to southern Alabama. I mean, there's a lot of woods down there.
20-mile radius is a huge area.
Yeah. I don't think the money. Hypothetically, if Jessie Smith was DB Cooper and buried the money, I don't think it's going to be found unless a family member is able to get the specific location. I don't think we're going to find the money in Alabama at all. So, I mean, that's just a personal belief.
So the only time Cindy ever talked to her dad about this was when he was having some sort of reaction to medication.
Yes, and I think that's in line with other suspects. I was listening to you had Greg Gossett on, and he said that he only talked to his father about it once or twice. That could either be because with an allergic reaction, he could have just been saying things, right? But there's too many coincidences, I think, in Jessie Smith's story that it can't be ignored. And I think there are suspects out there with less connecting them to the case than what Jessie Smith has.
Did he smoke cigarettes?
Yeah, I was just about to say he smoked Raleigh's at the time period, which makes sense. Raleigh's, I've read things of people who have smoked Raleigh's, and they've said it's a cheap cigarette. It's not very good. It hurts your throat, and it's the perfect cigarette that Jessie Smith would have been smoking. I believe it's a cigarette he probably was smoking. And Cindy confirmed that. She said, "Oh, he smoked Raleigh's growing up. Raleigh's were cheap cigarettes. They didn't have high quality tobacco or anything. A guy like Jessie Smith, who was smoking, who was a smoker for his adult life, those would have been the cigarettes he could afford, and those would have been the cigarettes he was smoking. So I think it makes sense that he was smoking those in 1971, and would have been smoking them on the plane.
What about his eye color?
The physical descriptions vary. That was another, I guess, wow moment for me. I read his World War II draft card, which is available online. It was like reading DB Cooper's. It was like reading the FBI report of what he looked like. 5'11", brown hair, brown eyes. The weight was a little bit off, but I mean, he was very young at the time. He could have gained 30 pounds when he was at the point when he was 47.
Oh yeah, we're all a little bit thinner
Yeah,
at 17 than we are at 47.
absolutely, absolutely. In the physical description, and I've seen photographs, it's a very very close match. And one of the things I'll discuss is perhaps one of the biggest things that gets overlooked in the Cooper case, in my opinion, and that's the hairline of a suspect. Um, Jessie Smith had a very prominent widow's peak, and if you've seen Unsolved Mysteries and you've seen Schaffner's sketch, she's got the widow's peak being like, and he's got a real bad receding hairline. That's sort of what Jessie Smith looked like during that time period, and so that's probably another thing that stood out to me is okay. He had some sort of receding hairline. To what extent is debatable, but when you see suspects like Dwayne Weber and I'll say William Smith, they had full heads of hair. And it's one thing to claim that the suspect had a toupee on, but it's another thing to say that they shaved off the part of their hair to make it look like they had a receding hairline. Um, that just doesn't make any sense to me. It would have had to
It
be
doesn't make any sense to me either.
it would have had to be his either a really really good toupee, because most toupees tend to cover up the forehead so you can't tell that you're bald. Uh, you would have had to be a high end makeup artist to come up with something that looked like you had a receding hairline. But if you were shaving off part of your hair to make it look like you were balding, that would grow back very very strange. It would have been a very strange haircut and surely noticeable, unless you shaved your
Yeah.
head, and that wasn't exactly a fashionable thing to do in 1971.
No, not at all. I've always been weary of the he wore makeup or a toupee or a hairpiece because Tina sat next to him for 5 hours and not sat across the table from him. She sat directly next to him and lit his cigarettes. I mean, you put a woman next to a guy for 5 hours, she would notice if he was wearing a toupee. She would notice if he was wearing makeup.
Especially a flight attendant, because they're dealing with people all the time. Schaffner, when she originally got the note, it's just another businessman trying to give me his phone number.
Exactly.
They work with people on a daily basis. It would have had to have been his real hair, and that's one of the things that frustrates me about Cooper suspects is you get someone like William J. Smith, who I think there's a lot of evidence suggesting he could have been the hijacker, a lot of evidence suggesting he contacted Max Gunther, but he had a full head of hair, and if Tina Mucklow was sitting next to him for 5 hours, she would have noticed if he had a full head of hair. So that's something that frustrates me with the case. Not necessarily with Jessie Smith. He's got the hairline that matches the description, so I'm happy about that. But it's a frustrating piece that I think gets overlooked a little bit in the Cooper world.
Well, there's a lot of, hey, I found a suspect. Now I'm going to fit the narrative to my suspect.
Exactly, and that's something I don't want to do. I don't want to, you know, I don't want to start making all these. Oh well, he had some paratrooping experience, but that means that means he knew exactly what he was doing. Uh, some people are like, oh well, he flew on an airplane before. That means he knew everything there was to know about the Boeing 727, and that just it doesn't make any sense to me.
How would Jesse Smith know about that you could jump off that plane?
With aviation, when he said fly at this specific altitude, uh, put the wings down at this specific amount, at this specific angle. I don't think that would have been, you know, the the common thread is that oh well that's secretive knowledge. There's no way unless he was like CIA he would have known about that. If the flaps, I don't think it was that difficult to find out about it. With the flaps and the altitude, I think if he had just read some aviation handbook at the library, he could have figured that out. The aft stairs is a little bit of a different story. Um, but again, I believe there was some magazine that came out that mentioned, oh well, these aft stairs on the 727 can be dropped during flight. Also, I mean, that could have also been an assumption that Smith made. Oh well, there's these aft stairs here. Release them during the flight or when it's in the air. He may not have exactly known for certain that they dropped during flight, but he could have been like, these aft stairs drop on the ground. Why wouldn't they drop when it's in the air? So again, that's speculation, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, like Walter Recka, that's, they say that Tina told him the stairs could be lowered. He planned to jump out the side.
I think Smith was maybe flying by the seat of his pants a little bit. So when that, when Tina asked him, "Oh, well, do you have a grudge against our airline?" He may. It's always a big thing. Oh well, he definitely had a grudge. Well, you know, if someone asked me, do you have a grudge against this airline? Well, no, maybe I don't, but I'll just say, oh well, I have a grudge, just to, have Tina stop asking these questions. So a lot of people play up the grudge. I don't necessarily think there could have been a specific grudge. He could have just been angry at life, angry that he, had to work with people who thought they were smarter than him, who had college degrees, angry that, he had 7 kids and, he wasn't making enough money. He could have been angry at a number of things and just said, oh, well, yeah, I have a grudge. I don't have a grudge against your airline, but I just have a grudge.
Yeah, some people put more weight into that than others. It could just be, like you were saying, the way he answered the question and the way Tina phrased it.
Yeah.
And it really means nothing. Or it's the whole secret to figuring out who D.B. Cooper was, but we don't know. I think what you said is right. That it could mean absolutely nothing, and it was just the way the question was asked and the way it was answered, and now we're looking into it after the fact.
Yeah, and
Because he didn't say, I have a grudge against the president. I have a grudge against the military. I have a grudge against my ex wife. It was just, I just have a grudge.
yeah, it's almost
Well,
something I would
don't
say.
a lot of people?
Yeah, if someone asked me that, I'd probably say the same thing. Oh, I just have a grudge.
All right, Dan, here's the most difficult question to answer. How did the money get on Tina Baer?
I seriously think that it probably just flew out somehow and somehow ended up in the Columbia. I don't think the Tina Baer find it's something that again kind of gets played up a little bit. Okay, you find it was only $3,000 or somewhere around there that they found on Tina Baer.
5,800.
5,800, my bad. So I mean, there's a couple possibilities. When he was jumping, it could have flown out and ended up. They recently debunked the Washougal washdown theory or whatever, but it could have flown out. Someone could have found it and buried it at Tina Baer. Cooper could have gotten on the ground, got to a road, stopped the first car, handed the guy $5,800, said drive. The guy finds out that was probably DB Cooper, buries the money at Tina Baer, or throws it in the Columbia or something. I don't think that the Tina Baer money is that important to the case. I think there's some evidence that it wasn't. I don't think it was buried. I think it was definitely in the Columbia at some point, just from the deterioration of the bills. I think if you had buried this money underground, the bills wouldn't have been as deteriorated as they were. So I don't think it's that important to the case. I think there are probably more important things that should be looked at. I think it was just a really lucky coincidence that Brian Ingram found the money, and that it ended up on Tina Baer. I don't think it's that important. I just think it ended how it ended up there. I don't think Cooper put it. If Cooper was Jessie Lee Smith or William J. Smith or anyone that wasn't living in the direct area, it doesn't make any sense that they would place it there, or
Right.
one of their, because there's no way Jessie Smith went back, in 1979 or 1980 to bury $5,800 at some beach. Doesn't make any sense. I think it's more possible that this money could have been found by somebody, or um, Cooper gave it to somebody for helping him, and they realized, look, I can't have this money anymore. I feel guilty about it. They threw it in the Columbia, or they buried it at Tina Bar. But I don't think Cooper placed it there, and I don't think it's terribly important to the case.
Okay. What about the drop zone and the flight path? Because that's been debated pretty hotly. Well, let's just say forever. I was going to say recently, but
Yeah, no, it's always
for
going
the
to be
last 49 years.
debated. I think they had the general location. If first of all, there's no way he flew out, or he jumped from the plane in Oregon or Nevada or whatever. He jumped in that general location at that general time. It's more probable to me that the jump zone is generally correct. They may have been off by a little bit, but that he got away, and they weren't able to find anything. The FBI didn't begin their search till the next morning. He jumps down, gets out of the woods, flags a truck or whatever, or a car, and gets back to Portland. Debating the drop zone by a couple miles or whatever isn't you're not going to find anything. I think at least 48 years down. So you're almost wasting your time on the argument. If they would have found if hypothetically Cooper had died, which I don't see any evidence suggesting that, someone would have found something. Again, it wasn't like he jumped over Mount Rainier or something. He jumped in a populated area. Someone would have found something at some point by now if he had died or left behind evidence. So
I agree with you.
debating the drop zone and the flight path by a couple miles, it's more likely that he just got away. The FBI didn't start searching till the next morning. He had plenty of time to get away, and that's probably what happened.
Do you think the bomb was real?
Absolutely not. If you're buying dynamite, they don't sell dynamite in red tubes or whatever. Dynamite's usually a tan color. Jessie Smith he was a plant electrician, or worked as in electrical engineering in some facet at these plants. He could have taken a couple of spare wires, bought a battery from a hardware store, a couple of flares, and you've got yourself a bomb. The bomb itself isn't the the bomb could have looked probably worse than what Cooper had it as, and still have gotten the same effect. Because if you're the pilot of that aircraft, if you're Captain Scott, it doesn't matter if he has a small case that fits in the palm of his hand. He could say, "This is a bomb in my hand. I could blow up this aircraft." It's going to be the same situation. You have to take the same precautions. And the bomb looked real enough to a flight attendant who isn't skilled, and she doesn't work for Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow aren't bomb experts. They weren't in the military. They weren't demolition experts. The bomb looked real enough to them, and that's all Cooper needed. He didn't need to show the bomb again. He didn't need to show the bomb to anyone else. It got its intended effect, and he got his money. So I think if Cooper was to build a real bomb, his MO would have been completely different. He was calm, cool, collected. If I hijacked an aircraft and I built a real bomb and had it on my lap, I'd be sweating the entire time. Especially if I have one wire here and one wire here, and if I touch them together, this bomb's going to explode. One wrong move, the case falls, you're all dead. Cooper was sitting there smoking, joking, drinking. That he wasn't nervous at all. And I think if I had a real bomb, whether how experienced I am, I would have been nervous because the bomb could go off at any moment.
That's true. But what if they called him on it? Because I agreed with you 100% until recently, and Shayna Roth has kind of changed my mind a little bit about that. What if they called his bluff?
That's a what if question. Okay,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you
what
can't really be in a liability position with an aircraft and
what if they called this
tell
bluff?
someone to prove it.
Florence Schaffner, when Jeffrey Gray interviewed her, she's still shaking about it. There's Florence Schaffner and Tina Muckler were probably too scared to, ask, hey, is your bomb there real? What's he gonna say? You want me to demonstrate? The bomb was probably fake, but the captain, the flight attendants, they're gonna take the precautions necessary to ensure that of the safety of the passengers. And again, that the bomb could have been, it could have been, the size of the palm of his hand. They probably would have taken the same precautions. With McCoy, he was threatening them with a hand grenade. They took the same precautions, gave him more money. So, I the bomb was probably fake, but there's no way they would have called his bluff. They wouldn't risk calling his bluff if it was real or fake.
Yeah, there's way too much liability in that.
Absolutely. It wouldn't have made sense, especially in 1971 when these were common occurrences. Today, with TSA and everything, that may have been a legitimate question. That may be a legitimate question, but in 1971, no way it would have questioned him on it.
What do you think about the fact that there are so many sketches? You know, there is that Unsolved Mysteries sketch with the Widow's Peak. There's the Bing Crosby sketch and sort of the Cary Grant sketch.
It's frustrating. It's one of the things that I think the FBI dug themselves into the ground with in terms of quickly finding a suspect. Because what probably happened. I mean, Jessie Smith doesn't really look like the Bing Crosby sketch at all, and they had that out for a year or 6 months or whatever. And the best time to catch a suspect is right after it happens. So if they come out with that sketch, first of all, they're not going to be looking in Alabama. The sketch is completely off. I mean, even the Cary Grant sketch isn't. It's closer, but it's not perfect. Um, it's frustrating. And one of my biggest things that I've noticed, I'm pretty new to the DB Cooper case, and one of the things I've noticed is just how people love to use those sketches for different suspects. For example, Sheridan Peterson and Kenneth Christensen, they love to use that Bing Crosby sketch and say, look, it's a direct match. But they don't match the other two sketches. With William J. Smith, they match it to the Cary Grant sketch and say, well, this guy's a perfect match. And with Dwayne Weber's laughable. They connect him to the Unsolved Mystery sketch, and the hairline again looks completely different. The face is close, but it's kind of frustrating. The exception to that is probably William Gossett. He looks like both the Bing Crosby and the Cary Grant sketches, which I didn't even know that was possible. But yeah, he's a deep.
I know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, he's close with both, and that maybe that's something. But it's a frustrating aspect of the case where people love to use the sketches to they pin one sketch on the suspect and disregard the others.
With some of the suspects, some get a lot more attention than others, and people who aren't well versed in this seem to fall into one of these suspects. And I'd like to talk about Rackstraw and McCoy.
Yeah,
And let's include Weber in that also. Weber and McCoy both shared one very distinguishable, very prominent feature. Both of them had ears that stuck out quite a bit. Enough that if you met them at the bar and then the next day said, what did that guy look like? The first thing I would say is, oh yeah, McCoy and Weber, they both had these ears that stuck out. Would be the first thing I would say about those guys. Because it's a prominent feature. And I can't believe that Tina and Alice and Florence would say that it wouldn't be the first thing that would come out of their mouth. Dude had huge ears.
absolutely.
And Rackstraw, same thing. He was in his late 20s. Well, and with McCoy, Rackstraw and McCoy both are in their late 20s. You can't tell me that Tina, who was, 24 or 25 years old, would confuse a 28-year-old guy with a 50-year-old guy, with a 45-year-old guy. I just don't buy that for a second. And I hear people all the time, oh, I know who DB Cooper was. It was McCoy. Oh, I know who it was. It was Rackstraw. Oh, I know who it was. It was Weber. But
Absolutely.
if you get on the forums and read the books that the people have written, those suspects fall apart the quickest.
Yeah, it's all about money. They pour all this money and this airtime into Rackstraw, for example, and uh, it's all speculation. They confronted Rackstraw in, I think that they did a History Channel documentary, and they confronted Rackstraw at like a marina or something, and they're constantly like, "Oh yeah, tell us you're DB Cooper, you're DB Cooper," and he's like, I think he gets a kick. Rackstraw got a kick out of it. Oh yeah, they think I'm DB Cooper again. And he said at the end of the thing, I didn't get on any Northwest Airlines flight. Like that should be enough. Why do you have to keep harassing the guy? He looks nothing. He doesn't really look like the sketch. And they tried. They spent all this money on the documentary, and that's all people need. Oh, the History Channel ran this documentary, so it has to be true. Anytime a book comes out about a specific suspect, Recka, for example, they love to talk about how, some guy remembered 45 years after the fact that he met Walter Recka in Clay Elum, which doesn't make any sense. Clay Elum's east; it's east of Seattle. There's no way Cooper ended up there. It's all about how much money they pour into documentaries and books and things like that. And you're right. People don't. Not everyone's a Cooperite. They watch a documentary and say, okay, that's all I need to hear about the case. They don't take the time and invest time into researching different suspects and learning about the case. They just go with what the TV's saying. So, maybe it's a little frustrating, but that's just how the world works, I guess.
What would it take to solve this case?
Physical evidence. That's really it. You would need physical evidence. A parachute, money, DNA, something, because we're almost at the 50th anniversary, right? No one, all of the Cooper suspects, with the exception of one or two, are they're not around anymore. So it's no one's gonna come. No 97-year-old is gonna come out and say, "Oh yeah, I'm DB Cooper." That's probably not gonna happen. So if you can locate physical evidence, that would maybe not solve the case in every instance, but it would probably come close at least.
Why is it still unsolved?
Well, there's two ways to say that it could be unsolved. One is that just Cooper was such a great criminal. He covered all of his bases and just he was able to evade authorities. Second reason why it's not solved is the FBI the FBI did a poor job in some circumstances. The sketches being one of them. Not searching until the next morning is one of them. When the pilots felt the oscillation in the aircraft at 8:13, what the FBI should have done immediately is said, okay, the pilots in the cockpit are reporting that something weird occurred here, and send out agents from Portland immediately to that area. You may have had a shot at catching Cooper. But when you wait 12 hours, that's just giving them Cooper head start. And I think especially recently when the case was still open and active, they didn't want to waste their time running fingerprints and things. I was listening just yesterday to when you had Greg Gossett on, and he was saying that you have my father's fingerprints. Why don't you run them to what you have? And one of the FBI agents said, "Oh well, that just means he could have been on a previous flight." Like, what are the chances that he was on the previous flight of that aircraft, and then used the same aircraft again to hijack it? I don't think that actually happened. I think someone would have recognized him if he was on the same flight twice. So I think the FBI just kind of got, after maybe 1990, just sort of gave up and didn't exhaust all their resources. It would be one thing if the FBI ran as many fingerprints as they could, did all of the searching they could, were proactive, and Cooper just got away. But the FBI they didn't they stopped trying, which, yeah, I think if they had tried a little bit more, they would have at least uncovered more evidence, and maybe we would have more to work on as citizens. But we don't, and I think the FBI could be to blame for some of that.
If Jessie Smith is DB Cooper, why did he choose the name Dan Cooper when he boarded the plane?
I have a couple theories on this. One of them is Cordalt's, the rayon company he worked for. It was a global firm. They had facilities in. It was a UK based firm. They were based in England, so they had factories in England, um, France, which is important, Pakistan. They had one in Cornwall, Canada, which is right next to. It borders on Quebec, which is French Canada. It's possible that someone could have visited from someone from France, for example, a company representative could have visited the facility he worked at. That's a theory. Another interesting, maybe it's probably just a coincidence, but another interesting thing I found was Smith's paternal grandfather was an immigrant to Alabama from French Canada. Which the reason that's interesting is that if you're immigrating from French, throughout history, people have immigrated to America from French Canada. That's not unique, but it's the fact he went to Alabama that's a little strange. Usually they go to Louisiana or New England. I've never heard of a French Canadian moving to Alabama. They're just so different in, I guess, cultures that it a little strange to me. But anything's possible. I guess another thing that I think gets overlooked with the Dan Cooper comics, which, in my opinion, is it has to be the source of the name. It's just you have a comic book character who's who parachutes out of planes, who flies planes, with the same name as the hijacker, who did essentially the same thing. That he could have picked any name. He could have picked David Johnson, Stephen Andrews. He picked Dan Cooper, which is the name of a. It's too much of a coincidence to ignore.
I agree. I've said it a million times. There's an infinite number of male names.
Absolutely,
And to land on that one is
it's one in a
pretty
million.
nuts.
Something that I think it's overlooked too with the comic is that post World War II, the the U.S. Army was and the U.S. military was very active in Europe, especially the countries of France and Belgium. They still are, especially in Belgium. And the Dan Cooper comics were it was a Franco-Belgian comic. It was originally printed in France and Belgium. And in fact, there's a Twilight Zone episode that revolves around a U.S. Army base or U.S. Air Force base in France. So there were plenty of American servicemen in the Army and Air Force that were stationed over there in France and Belgium and could have been exposed to this comic at some point. And I've never seen that theory come up, which is because post World War II, the U.S. Army was active in Europe, in Western Europe. So it's possible that there was some exposure there to the Dan Cooper comics. And another thing is with the Dan Cooper comics is when you read a comic book, how many, are you really looking at the words? Because, the comic was in French, but some people, not all people, but some people, when they read a comic book, they're just looking at the pictures the whole time. They don't care about the story or the words. So what's stopping an American serviceman in France or anybody really picking up this comic book because it looks cool and then just looking at the pictures? They can read Dan Cooper as the title. They don't necessarily need to know French. I've never seen that 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 thought of before with the Dan Cooper comics.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there wouldn't have been a lot of entertainment for dudes overseas. Like you were saying, they might see that it says Dan Cooper on the front. So, oh, maybe I'll be able to read that. Well, it's a comic book, so it doesn't take that much reading skill, but because the name Dan Cooper, you picked it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I think that's very possible. And if he's, I'm not real familiar with what comic books they had in New Guinea, but it's very possible that he could have come across that comic book in his travels.
Absolutely. And I also don't know, his paternal grandfather was a French Canadian, and it says on the census records that he spoke French. So I don't know for sure. Cindy didn't confirm it, but it's possible that French was passed down to some degree from grandfather to father to son. I don't know, but it's possible. Yeah, it's a possibility that Jessie Smith or really anyone in America with military experience could have been exposed to this comic. Even if you lived in Ohio or whatever and took a trip to French Canada, you could have been exposed to this comic.
Have you spoke to any other family members or just Cindy?
I've just spoken to Cindy. I don't want to. I think it's very. I think it's. I don't think it's right to contact and harass family members. If maybe at some point down the line, I will maybe send an email or a letter or something saying, I've learned about your father. I'd be interested to learn a little bit more. If you don't want to contact me, you don't have to. I think it's improper when people harass family members, especially if they say, look, I don't want to talk to you. Cindy's been very forthcoming. She posted on Reddit, look, I think my father's DB Cooper. So that's one thing. Obviously I'll start a dialogue if that's the case. If you advertise that you think your father's DB Cooper, that's one thing. But if you're not saying that, if you're not posting that, and you want to be left alone, I think you should be left alone if your father's DB Cooper or otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to go about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think because even if you get a little snippet of information, what's the cost almost? I don't want to start harassing people because I have this theory about their father or their grandfather. I can only imagine if I got a letter saying, "Oh, I think your grandfather's the Zodiac killer." That it's not that I'm comparing the Zodiac killer and DB Cooper, but it's still just I wouldn't want to get that letter, and I'm sure Jessie Smith's children or grandchildren wouldn't want to get that letter either. So I just want to be mindful of them. So
Speaking of the Zodiac, do you think there's any connections between DB Cooper and the Zodiac killer?
no, absolutely not, absolutely not. I'll say there's two different types of Cooper suspects. There's ones where there's circumstantial cases, which there is for a fair amount of them, and there's ones where it's people say, oh well, it was a conspiracy theory with the government, and Frank Morris is DB Cooper, and some of them are just a little out there. There's no way. I don't think the Zodiac Killer and DB Cooper are the same person. The sketches aren't the same. Some people try to say they are. I don't see a connection. The Zodiac Killer's MO is completely different from DB Cooper's. The Zodiac Killer constantly sends letters, and obviously there were DB Cooper letters, but there's no way to know for certain if they were him. The Zodiac Killer called the police after his crimes. I don't see a connection. I don't think it's a legitimate comparison. Yeah, I don't see a connection.
What do you think about the letters? The DB Cooper letters?
Well, really, after any big crime like that, you're gonna, at least in 1971, you're gonna see people send in a letter. Oh yeah, this. I mean, if you think about DB Cooper on the plane, he's calm, reserved, polite. He does not seem like the type of person to land and send a letter in. And at least for Jessie Smith, my suspect, I guess, he lives in Alabama. If a letter came in from Mobile, Alabama, to the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, they're automatically gonna send that to the FBI, and the FBI is gonna be looking down there. So I'd say most of the letters were probably just 16-year-olds playing a prank. Oh, let me clip out some magazine headings and say I'm DB Cooper, and this will be kind of fun. I do think that there's maybe a small possibility that Rackstraw sent in one of the letters trying to take credit for it. I don't believe it may not be 100%, but he may have sent in one of the letters. I think that there's maybe an argument for that. I don't believe he's DB Cooper. I think he might have just been trying to take credit, but I don't think DB Cooper had anything to do with those letters. I don't think that was who he was as a person to send in letters to a newspaper or the FBI.
Yeah, he seemed to be so careful with his evidence, but then to write a letter? I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, because I mean, a letter gets sent in, and obviously the newspaper's probably going to forward it to the FBI, and then they'd have a fingerprint maybe, or they might not. Obviously, they probably weren't getting DNA, but they would have at least had a fingerprint. That just doesn't seem like something he would do at all.
Yeah, and I think a couple of the letters are signed DB Cooper, and one is just a rich man, I think,
Yeah,
if I have that correct.
yeah, it's probably just some 16, 17-year-old kid thinks it's funny to clip out some magazine headings, the system that beats the system, and oh, I'm here in Vancouver, and it was probably just a prank. Most of them were probably just a prank. Rackstraw may have sent in the one. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, and Rackstraw and McCoy both, to go back to why they're not the best suspects, they were both in police custody after the hijacking. And I think that if there was anything that could have linked them to that hijacking, they would have pinned it on him, especially McCoy.
Yeah,
But they couldn't do it.
I was reading something like, I guess in the book DB Cooper, the real McCoy, they were trying to claim, oh well, some medallion was left on board with his initials from Brigham Young. I haven't heard that before. I don't know if they were just putting that there to try to sell the book. But if McCoy had really left, and that's a McCoy thing to do, is just leave stuff on board. If he had just left his medallion with his initials on it from Brigham Young, I mean, the FBI would have been done in a day. I don't. It's just Rackstraw, McCoy. They're suspects, but they're not good suspects. They're too young. Rackstraw and McCoy have two completely different MOs from Dan Cooper. They just don't strike me as Dan Coopers at all.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
I don't think Rackstraw could have kept his composure for 6 8 hours or whatever. I think he would have blown up at some point, started waving the bomb around. McCoy would have made more mistakes. DB Cooper didn't even really make a mistake, in my opinion. McCoy would have left stuff on board, made a mess. There's really no substantial evidence connecting them to the crime.
Do you think it's possible that McCoy was tutored by the real DB Cooper?
No, not at all. Rich McCoy did it out of I read about McCoy. He did it he did it out of desperation, really. He needed money, and he was telling friends, oh well, if I were to do something like this, I'd request more money and I'd do it this way. And if the real DB Cooper, whoever he is, had tutored Richard McCoy would not have made such a mess of himself during the hijacking. He would have known to collect all of his letters. He would have known to. He would have probably not used a hand grenade and a handgun to threaten the crew. He would have been a lot more reserved. He would have probably not requested so much money. Although McCoy landed with all of the money, if I remember correctly. He didn't lose any of it. So
Right.
yeah, so there's no way, in my opinion, that McCoy and the real DB Cooper are connected in any way.
All right, now to change topics wildly. Do you think that money could have been spent, that Cooper's money could have been spent?
Some of it, I believe some of it ended up in circulation. And if perhaps he got on the ground with more of the money, maybe he did get on the ground with $200,000 and then just gave some of it to different people, the money would have been spent. Yet another way the FBI screwed up is how they release the serial numbers. They release them in non-sequential order. No one is going to, no bank, no casino is going to look at every single serial number of every 20 that was deposited or given to them. So there, I think, especially if let's say it's Jessie Smith, he could have gone back to Alabama, and no one down there is going to look for DB Cooper money. They probably didn't even get. They probably didn't. They might not have even gotten the FBI list or whatever of all of the numbers on the bills. So he could have probably spent the money, I think, slowly and over time, because obviously he wasn't a rich man. If he just shows up at a bank with stacks of 20s, they're going to suspect something. If he shows up at a casino with that amount of money, they might suspect something. And certainly his friends might suspect something. So, but I think if he spent it slowly, methodically, and over time, he would have gotten away with it.
Yeah, I agree with that. How would they track the money? Like you said, it was a physical list of non-sequential serial numbers
Uh, I
of
don't.
10,000 of them.
Yeah, there's no way. There's no way that any bank, any casino, you know, if the Seattle National or Portland National Bank was like, "Oh, we want to catch DB Cooper," and they were willing to help, I still don't think they would have taken the time to go through every serial number. I think the FBI would have had more luck if they had maybe take because they released that list pretty quickly. I think if they had taken the time, maybe a week, to organize all of the uh, numbers or whatever, you know, maybe they would have lost that week. But in the long run, banks and casinos at least had a sequential and easier to reference list of numbers because no bank, no casino, no store is going to look through 10,000 sequences of numbers. I don't. No person would want to do that. I wouldn't do it no matter how much money you paid me. That's just. It's almost mean to do that to an employee.
I mean to do that. I like
Maybe they
that.
could get a prisoner or something to do that. But yeah,
Prisoners. Oh, so Dan condones slave labor of finding the Cooper money.
well, maybe 1971, but now there's a website for it. So if you stumble upon a 1969 $20 bill, I would type those numbers in. But
So what do you do next, Dan? What are you going to do with this? Are you going to keep working on it? Are you going to write a book?
no,
What's your plan?
no way to write a book. There's I think there's almost too many books out there about DB Cooper and about DB Cooper suspects that it's kind of been saturated a little bit. I think even if I wrote a book, first of all, it wouldn't be very good. I'm not a polished writer, and it probably wouldn't sell very well because of just how many DB Cooper books there are. I would probably just keep learning about this guy because I know quite a bit. I've made a lot of connections between Cooper and Jessie Smith, but I think there's still more to learn about this guy, and I still think I have a good circumstantial case. I don't think I you know maybe I'd send it into the FBI. Maybe I don't. I almost don't even see a point at this. It just wouldn't. I don't think it would really make a lot of sense. They really don't. The FBI have shown recently that they don't have an interest in the case. All they want is physical evidence.
They're not interested unless you have the money or the parachute.
I mean, with William Smith, I use that as an example. I mean, that was a really good circumstantial case that's been researched and documented. If I was the FBI, I wouldn't just, and that got sent into the FBI. I wouldn't just, throw it in the trash or file it or whatever. I mean, you have his fingerprints. Would it really kill them to take, 25 minutes, an hour to run the fingerprints? I don't think so. But they've shown to not really have an interest anymore, and it's kind of just up to the civilian sleuths to solve and discuss the case. The FBI's kind of just given up.
And can we do it?
I think we can if there's enough of us, and if it doesn't die, because a lot of the Cooper researchers, who have done great work, aren't getting any younger, and there's a lack of younger people like myself who are interested in the case. That's a problem, because to see this case die would be a real, it would suck, really. Um, just a couple months ago, I'm sure you watched it, the Let Me Know video on YouTube.
Yes, I certainly did.
It was that was really it was really well made. It wasn't focused on a specific suspect. It gave all the facts really well, and it was, I mean, it was incredible animations and things. And that seemed to get, I mean, it was a very popular video made by a very uh, skilled person, and that seemed to generate some interest especially with younger people who spend a lot of time on YouTube. But out of the 3 million people who watch that video, there may, maybe there'll be 5 people who look into the case further and decide to invest a significant amount of time in it. I think if enough people are working on this case, if enough people want to keep it alive, we could solve it. Or we could get more evidence at least. Because, I mean, the tie evidence, which I think is the most, it's some of the best evidence in the case for sure, that only came out a couple years ago. So if we can get enough people working on it, people with different skills, maybe I can't really think of anything offhand, but someone with a specific skill set that they can contribute to the case. Tom Kay is a paleontologist, I think. A lot of skills he can contribute. If we get more people like that, we could at least get more evidence. We could get more theories. We can get even more suspects. Because, some people don't like to they don't like to focus on suspects, which I understand. But suspects fuel the case a little bit. Even if you don't like Jessie Smith, which there are things about him which, maybe don't add up perfectly, you could still take something, maybe because I mentioned he worked for a fertilizer company. He worked for a rayon manufacturer. Maybe, there's a rayon plant in California that you happen to know about. And you just think, oh, well, my grandfather worked in a rayon plant. I'm not saying it's your grandfather, but maybe you could start looking into that and ask him questions and things like that and contribute something to the case.
My biggest fear is that we figure out who it was but don't get to know the story. And it bothers me with Jesse Smith even a little bit too, because if he only had that one conversation with his daughter when he was under the influence and then came back and was like, I don't want to talk about it anymore. Well, now he's dead. So if it really is Jesse Smith, I don't get to find out what happened when his feet hit the ground.
Yeah.
From jumping out of that airplane. And that really does bug me. The idea that this is solved, but not to my satisfaction. Just not being able to know the story. The idea that it's solved without the story, I don't know if I could take that. I would rather it be unsolved than know who it is without the story.
Yeah,
What do you think about that?
That's valid. Maybe I think a little bit differently. I think if, for example, let's say hypothetically someone finds a couple $20 bills in southern Alabama. Well, there's enough of a circumstantial case to say Jesse Smith probably put those there. That would probably be enough for me. The story is important, obviously, and I would love to know, what happened when you got down. How'd you get back to Portland? How'd you escape the police in Portland? How'd you get home? What's the motive? Those are all important, and I would love to know the answer to that. That's probably not going to happen, because all the Cooper suspects have either passed away or they're 95 and older. I don't think, there's still a possibility it could be solved, but we probably will never know the story.
Oh, you're killing me, Dan.
Well, it's unfortunate. I think it is unfortunate. I mean, I would love to know the story, and who knows? Maybe maybe DB Cooper is someone we haven't even thought of yet, and they wrote a detailed description of what happened and put it in a safe somewhere. So we may still find out. We may just Jesse Smith could have just been an average guy who just so happened to have some connections to DB Cooper. Kenneth Christensen could have just been a flight attendant. One of the things that keeps me awake on this case is that we DB Cooper has already been suggested as a suspect, and you know it could have been disregarded as, oh well, it's not him because of this, or it could have been someone the FBI looked at and said, oh well, he's 2 inches taller than what they're saying. I don't think it's him. Part of me almost thinks that DB Cooper has been found and suspected of being DB Cooper, but isn't considered a suspect for for specific reasons, or he's a suspect that's already been promoted as a suspect, but not everyone is on board. So, I would love to see this case solved. I think it can be solved, but I think it will be very difficult to be solved.
And you're not confident it will be solved to my satisfaction, which is a bummer.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm bearer of bad news, I guess, but I mean that's just my theory. I mean, it's possible that the real Dan Cooper told somebody everything that happened, and that person could still be alive and well. Someone could find the real Dan Cooper and say, "Oh," and that person could have passed away, but have kept a detailed record of everything that happened, or kept a little bit of the money to prove that they are Dan Cooper, or kept the parachute in a closet somewhere. I mean, there's a lot we don't know, and there will probably be more suspects in the future. I mean, there will probably be 50 more episodes of the Cooper Vortex with 42 more suspects, all of which with a pretty convincing argument as to why why they could be DB Cooper.
Yeah, I think you're right, Dan. As much as I want to know the full story, I do agree with you. I think every day that has gone by, we're less and less likely to know the actual story. But does it get solved? It might. If it does get solved and I don't get to know the story, it'll be a bummer, but we'll move on, I guess.
Yeah, it's
All right, Dan. What haven't we covered yet?
I have a page of notes here. I mean, I have a few more things, like small things about Jesse Smith I could share. Um, but aside from that, I think we've covered all the big things. How I've connected the chemicals and his military experience and things, and so I think I've covered most of the major points I have.
Are there any minor points you want to cover?
Just a few more things, I guess, that I've noticed or sort of hypothesized from what I know about the DB Cooper case. In the I guess you could say, records of the case, um, you know, a big hypothesis was that Cooper could have been Catholic because he smoked and he drank, but he didn't use any profane language. Jesse Smith was a Catholic, buried in Catholic cemetery. Thought that was interesting. In terms of rayon production, where he was working in 1971, rayon emits a lot of carbon disulfide, CS2, and a main side effect of that is heart disease. And I believe Tom Kay or someone was hypothesizing that Cooper was taking some kind of medication for something. Could have been heart disease. I believe a heart condition was thrown out there as a possibility. I don't know if Jesse Smith had a heart condition. He did live to be 95, so maybe not. Another thing that I found kind of interesting was, again, the clip-on tie, which I think is interesting. I think it might be, additionally, um, in a work environment, it's very practical, especially for someone who's working with electrical grids and in sort of maybe a messy environment. You can take it on, throw it back on again. Uh, you don't need to be wearing it 24/7. Also, I mean, a clip-on tie is probably probably a little bit cheaper, and with 7 kids in the house, a wife, bills to pay, a clip-on tie might have been an economical choice, along with the Raleigh cigarettes. Titanium, which I thought was uh, obviously the titanium particles have generated a lot of discussion. They use titanium in rayon production. One of the benefits of titanium is that it doesn't corrode. And in both fertilizer production and rayon production, there's a lot of corrosive chemicals involved. So it's possible that the titanium particles could come from a machine or something that was in that environment that needed to be anti-corrosive. It's just a theory, but I think it's a possibility. And obviously in Pensacola, where he was working with in the fertilizer industry, they found titanium at the site when the EPA tested it. So there's a connection there. But I think those are most of the minor points. He did not grow up with a lot of money. Grew up very poor. So I've looked at census records from the 30s and the 40s. The family did not have much money. He did not grow up with a lot. He enlisted in the army as soon as he turned 18, perhaps as a means to make some money and send it back home. And this could have been another incident, or DB Cooper hijacking. Again, he probably needed money, maybe not just for himself, but for family members. He had 8 siblings, parents who were alive at the time, 7 kids. Someone in the family may have needed money. He might have been the most. He may have been the most apt to carry something like this out. And maybe another. I mean, the DB Cooper hijacking took place on Thanksgiving Eve, so one of the things that gets discussed is, well, if he's a DB Cooper suspect, he would have been there. Was he there the next day on Thanksgiving? Jessie Smith's entire family lived in southern Alabama. I have no doubt they were all together for Thanksgiving, and he had 8 siblings, and most, if not all of them, had quite a few kids. So you're talking about perhaps 100+ people at a Thanksgiving, maybe somewhere around there. That would have been, I don't want to say that he would have been missed necessarily, but it perhaps could have been explained away as, he's not feeling well, or he went on a little trip, or something, or maybe people in his family knew. I don't know, but those are just some interesting maybe coincidences I found regarding Jessie Smith.
You've done a lot of really good work on this, Dan, and you're a really sharp guy.
Thank you.
I'm very impressed by you. I look forward to all the work that I hope you'll continue to do on this case. And by the way, if you want to be on the DB Cooper forum, I might know a guy.
You might know DB Cooper.
No, I might know someone that can help
Yeah.
you get on that forum, though.
Yeah, I had set up an account, and then you needed an authorization email or something. And I kind of didn't get past that point. So
Yeah, there's a lot of slippery people inside the Cooper Vortex.
I've heard horror stories. People promoting something and constantly getting, it's not taken too favorably. But I still think it would be, it's still a great source for discussion on the case, and there's a lot of devoted people on there. Regardless of who their suspect is or why they're on there, I think there's still a lot of great discussion that goes on.
Definitely. Well, Dan, thanks for coming on the show, man. I really appreciate it. It was great to talk to you.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I mean, I've been a fan of the podcast before, and it's really it's great to have the opportunity to come on. So thank you.
If people want to tell you that you're wrong about everything, or they want to tell you that you got everything right, is there somewhere where they can do that?
So if you want to just share my email, that's probably the best place to contact me. If I just start getting spam from people, I can just delete it or whatever. But that's probably the best place to contact me, is through my email.
All right. Well, I will put it in the show notes. I won't read it aloud right now. So if you do want to get a hold of Dan, you'll have to take one extra step and click on the show notes before you harass him.
Yes.
Well, thanks again for coming on, Dan. I appreciate it.
Yes, thanks for having me on.
If you'd like to reach out to Dan, you can find his email in the show notes. Is there a suspect we haven't covered yet, or a theory you think we got wrong? Let us know. You can find us on Facebook. We are the Cooper Vortex. Instagram at the Cooper Vortex. On Twitter at DB Cooper Podcast. Or email us dbcooperpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you to Dan Baer for coming on the show and doing the work that I wouldn't. Thank you to Russell Colbert for doing the work that I couldn't. I'm Darren Schaefer, and thank you for listening to the Cooper Vortex.